Karen Matthews, a 42-year-old office manager with perfectly highlighted hair and a strong sense of entitlement, had been having a terrible day. It began at 6:30 a.m. when her alarm failed to go off, forcing her to rush through her carefully calibrated morning routine. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman whose face showed the strain of recent months, the fine lines around her eyes deeper than usual, her mouth set in what had become a perpetual frown. Her pristine Lexus SUV, normally a source of pride, now bore a small scratch on the driver's side door from yesterday's shopping trip. Karen had already left 3 voicemails for the mall management demanding security footage to identify the culprit. The scratch caught the morning light as she drove to Perks and Brew, her regular coffee stop for the past 6 years, when the baristas knew her complicated order by heart. "I specifically asked for almond milk, not oat milk," Karen said, pushing the light back across the counter. The young barista, new with a nose ring Karen found distasteful, apologized and quickly remade the drink. But Karen could taste that the temperature wasn't quite right. She took it anyway, leaving without tipping. At work, her assistant had called in sick for the 3rd time this month. Convenient that it's always on a Friday, Karen muttered to herself as she rescheduled meetings and handled the filing that was supposed to be completed yesterday. Her divorce papers arrived by courier before lunch. Derek was asking for the lake house, the one place where Karen still felt at peace. She shoved the envelope into her desk drawer, eyes stinging. By 3 p.m., Karen had left work early, claiming a migraine. In reality, she couldn't bear another moment of pretending everything was fine. The delivery notification on her phone promised her package would arrive by 4 p.m. She waited, watching the tracker as the delivery driver seemingly visited every house in the neighborhood except hers. At 4:32 p.m., the status updated, "Delivery attempted, no one available." Karen stormed to her front door, checking the non-existent delivery notice, seething at the blatant lie. She called customer service, working her way up to a supervisor who promised to expedite a delivery for tomorrow. "This is completely unacceptable," Karen said, her voice rising. "I've been a premium member for 7 years." The conversation ended with Karen hanging up in frustration. As she poured herself a glass of Chardonnay, her 3rd of the day, she noticed the sound. Music. A gentle Latin rhythm floating across the street from Familia Kitchen, the new restaurant that had replaced the accounting office that had, in Karen's opinion, been a much more suitable neighbor. The family who ran it seemed nice enough when they moved in 2 months ago, but lately they'd been playing music during their dinner service. Karen closed all her windows, but she could still detect the faint bass line. She turned on her television and the sound machine in the hallway, but her awareness of the music had become an obsession. She walked from room to room, convinced the sound was somehow getting louder, though it remained barely audible. After 20 minutes of stewing in frustration, the accumulated indignities of the day crystallized around this single irritation. The scratch on her car, the wrong milk in her coffee, the missed delivery, the divorce papers, and now this invasion of her peace. This was clearly an emergency. With righteous indignation swelling in her chest, Karen picked up her phone and dialed 911, certain that law enforcement would validate her complaints and finally give her the sense of control that had been slipping away from her for months. The 911 dispatcher, Sofia Rodriguez, had handled all types of genuine emergencies in her 8 years on the job. Tonight's shift had already been challenging. A 3-car pileup on Highway 5, 2 domestic disputes, and an elderly man experiencing chest pains. The clock on the wall read 7:42 p.m. as she took a sip of her lukewarm coffee and answered the next incoming call. 911, what's your emergency? Sophia's voice carried the practiced calm that had become second nature, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "Yes, hello, this is Karen Matthews at 1542 Oakwood Drive," came the clipped, agitated voice on the other end. "I need to report a serious disturbance." Sophia immediately began typing, her system automatically logging the caller's location. "What kind of disturbance are you experiencing, ma'am? Is anyone hurt?" "Not physically, no, but that restaurant across from my house. Familia something. They're blasting music, and it's absolutely intolerable. I can hear it through my closed windows." Karen's voice rose with indignation. "It's disturbing the peace and probably violating multiple city ordinances. I've had an extremely difficult day, and I can't even relax in my own home." Sophia's typing slowed as she realized the nature of the call. She'd handled 3 calls from this neighborhood in the past month, all noise complaints during reasonable hours. She glanced at the clock again. Not even 8 p.m. "Ma'am, I understand you're frustrated, but noise complaints during business hours should go through non-emergency channels. I can provide you with that number if you like." Karen's scoff was audible through the line. "If this isn't an emergency, I don't know what is. The constant thumping is giving me a migraine, and I'm a taxpayer. I deserve prompt service when I'm being harassed in my own home." Sophia took a deep breath, her training kicking in. She'd learned long ago that escalating with agitated callers only prolonged difficult calls. Through her headset, she'd hear the faint sound of Karen's television in the background, much louder than any music from across the street. Ms. Matthews, we take all calls seriously, but I need to inform you that misuse of emergency services can result in. Are you threatening me now? Karen interrupted. This is outrageous. I'm being threatened by a 911 operator while criminals run wild playing their music at all hours. I want your name and badge number or whatever you people have. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, thinking of the ambulance currently en route to a child having a severe allergic reaction just 3 miles away. She thought of the legitimate emergencies waiting in the queue, but protocol was protocol. My name is Sophia Rodriguez, operator number 4873. I'll dispatch an officer to your location to investigate the noise complaint, but please be aware that in the future, the non-emergency line would be more appropriate for these situations. The number is... Finally, Karen cut in. How long will it take? The officer should know I've been documenting all instances of this ongoing harassment. Sophia checked the available units, noting that most were dealing with higher priority situations. An officer will be there as soon as one becomes available. Ms. Matthews, is there anything else I should relay to them about your situation? Yes, tell them that I've been extremely patient, but enough is enough. And make sure they know this restaurant has been a problem since it opened. After ending the calls, Sophia added detailed notes to the dispatch. Noise complaint from 1542 Oakwood. Dr. Collard reports music from restaurant across street. Non-emergency nature, low priority. Caller previously reported similar complaints. She reluctantly assigned Officer Wilson, who was just clearing from another call, while silently apologizing for sending him on what was clearly not an emergency. Officer James Wilson was just finishing up paperwork from a fender bender when the call came through. 11 years on the force had taught him that Friday evenings brought a predictable mix of emergencies and nuisance calls. He glanced at his dashboard computer, reading the dispatch notes from Sophia, another noise complaint from Oakwood Drive, the third this month from the same vicinity. Wilson responding, he said into his radio, suppressing a sigh. His partner, Officer Tran, was on a dinner break after they'd spent the afternoon dealing with the aftermath of the Highway 5 accident. A 7-year-old girl had been airlifted to County General. James had held her hand until the paramedics arrived, promising her everything would be okay. He still had her blood on his uniform sleeve. He pulled out of the Quick Mart parking lot where he'd stopped to complete his report and headed toward the affluent Oakwood subdivision. The cruiser's headlights cut through the gathering dusk as the GPS directed him through familiar streets lined with manicured lawns and expensive homes. The subdivision had changed in recent years. What was once predominantly white upper-middle-class families had gradually diversified. The old accounting firm on the corner of Oakwood and Maple had closed when its owner retired and replaced 2 months ago by Familia Kitchen. James had eaten there twice, excellent empanadas, and the owner's son reminded him of his nephew. As he turned onto Oakwood Drive, James could see a woman standing on her porch, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. Even from a distance, her body language communicated irritation. Karen Matthews. He recognized her from previous calls, though they'd never formally met. Last time, another officer had responded to her complaint about teenagers skateboarding too loudly on a Saturday afternoon. James parked his cruiser and stepped out, straightening his uniform and adjusting his body camera to ensure it was recording. Department policy required documentation of all citizen interactions, a policy he personally supported. He approached with a practiced, neutral expression. "Good evening, ma'am. Officer Wilson responding to your call." Karen immediately stepped forward, not bothering with pleasantries. "Finally, I called nearly 30 minutes ago. Do you hear that noise? It's completely disrupting my evening. I work 60 hours a week and can't even have peace in my own home." James listened carefully, detecting only the faintest hint of music from across the street. "I understand you're concerned about noise from the restaurant, Ms. Matthews, Karen Matthews, and yes, it's been going on for weeks. They play that music," she said, pronouncing the word as if it were something distasteful, "every evening. I called the city twice already." James nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the tightening in his jaw. He could smell alcohol on her breath. "I'll certainly investigate. What time did the noise begin this evening?" "Around 7. But that's not the point. The point is they shouldn't be playing any music at all in a residential area. This was a quiet neighborhood before they moved in." James took out his department-issued decibel meter from his utility belt. "I'll need to take some readings from your property line, and then I'll speak with the restaurant owner. Would you mind showing me where you can hear the music most clearly?" Karen seemed momentarily surprised by his methodical approach, but quickly recovered. "Of course. Follow me. I can hear it from every room, but it's worst on the side of the house facing them." As they walked around her well-appointed home, James surreptitiously noted the readings on his meter. 42 decibels, well below the 60 decibel limit for commercial properties before 10 p.m. He also noticed the half-empty wine bottle visible through the kitchen window and the blaring television Karen had left on, significantly louder than any sound coming from across the street. "I'd like to see what's happening at the restaurant," he said after completing his assessment. "Would you care to accompany me?" Karen nodded emphatically, grabbing her phone as if to document evidence. "Absolutely. It's time someone did something about this situation." Familia Kitchen glowed with warm lighting against the deepening twilight. Through the windows, Officer Wilson could see about a dozen patrons, a modest Friday dinner crowd. The hand-painted sign above the door featured a stylized family gathered around a table, the restaurant's name in elegant script beneath. As Officer Wilson and Karen approached, the soft Latin guitar music became more audible, though still remarkably subdued. A bell chimed softly as they entered, and several diners looked up from their meals. An older couple smiled at Officer Wilson. They recognized him from community outreach events. Their expressions faltered when they noticed Karen. The restaurant interior was modest but impeccably clean, with colorful artwork depicting landscapes from Central America. Small potted succulents adorned each table, and the aroma of roasted chilies and fresh tortillas filled the air. A young man in his early 20s was carefully adjusting a small speaker in the corner, turning the volume even lower as they entered. Elena Morales emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. At 48, her face showed the lines of someone who had worked hard her entire life. Her expression shifted from concern to recognition when she saw Officer Wilson. "Officer, good evening," she said, approaching them with dignified composure. "Is everything okay?" Before Wilson could respond, Karen interjected, "No, everything is not okay. Your music is disturbing the entire neighborhood. I had to call the police because you clearly don't care about the residents who were here long before you." Several diners set down their utensils, uncomfortable with the confrontation. A young family with two small children at the corner table exchanged glances, the mother gathering her purse as if preparing to leave. "Ms. Matthews, please," Officer Wilson said quietly. "Let me handle this." Elena's shoulders tensed, but her voice remained steady. "We've received some anonymous complaints about the music, so we've been reducing the volume each week. Miguel," she gestured to the young man by the speaker, "was just turning it down again." Miguel nodded, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "It's already at level 3 out of 10, Mama." Officer Wilson took out his decibel meter again. "Mind if I take a reading in here?" "Of course not," Elena replied. The meter showed 52 decibels, equivalent to a quiet conversation and still well below the legal limit for a commercial establishment. "This is ridiculous," Karen said, her voice rising above the gentle music. "Who cares what some machine says? I can hear it from my house." An elderly man sitting near the door cleared his throat. "I can barely hear the music even sitting right here," he said. "My hearing aids pick up more from that table over there." He nodded toward a group of friends chatting over their meal. Officer Wilson turned to Elena. "Have you received any other complaints besides the anonymous ones?" he asked professionally. Elena hesitated, then gestured for them to follow her to the small counter that served as the restaurant's reception area. She pulled out a folder containing printed emails. "We've received several complaints through our website, all from the same IP address according to my son who helps with our technology. And we've had 3 visits from city inspectors in the past month. Unusual for an established restaurant, but we've passed every inspection." "That's because you're warned beforehand," Karen interrupted. "Actually, no," Elena said calmly. "They were all surprise inspections." Officer Wilson reviewed the emails, noting the similar language and tone across all of them despite the different names attached. He recognized the pattern, had seen this kind of targeted harassment before. "We invested our life savings in this restaurant," Elena continued quietly. "My husband worked 3 jobs for 15 years to save enough. We followed every regulation, obtained all permits. The previous business owner, Mr. Finley from the accounting office, he even helped us with the paperwork before he retired." Karen's demeanor faltered slightly at the mention of Mr. Finley, who had been respected in the neighborhood. A young server approached with a glass of water for Officer Wilson. He'd been in enough to be recognized as someone who never accepted anything else while on duty. The simple gesture highlighted how integrated the restaurant had already become in the community. "Miss Morales," Officer Wilson said, handing back the folder, "everything appears to be completely in order here." Outside Familia Kitchen, the evening had fully settled in. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Officer Wilson guided Karen away from the restaurant entrance toward a quiet spot near his cruiser. Her indignation seemed to have only intensified after seeing the reality inside the restaurant failed to match her complaints. "This is outrageous," Karen fumed, scrolling through her phone. "I'm going to call your supervisor. I pay taxes for police protection, not to be humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. Officer Wilson maintained his professional demeanor, though the muscles in his jaw tightened slightly. He positioned himself so his body camera had a clear view of their interaction. "Ms. Matthews, I need to address something important with you," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Calling 911 for non-emergencies is actually against the law in this state. It's classified as misuse of emergency services." Karen blinked, momentarily caught off guard. What? That's absurd. It was an emergency to me." "The law defines emergencies as situations requiring immediate assistance due to threats to life, safety, property, or situations where a crime is in progress," Officer Wilson explained. "Noise complaints, especially those within legal limits and during business hours, don't qualify." He retrieved his department-issued tablet and pulled up the municipal code, turning the screen toward her. Section 834.7 specifically states that knowingly using emergency services for non-emergency matters is punishable by fines up to $1,000 and potential criminal charges for repeated offenses. Karen's face flushed, her certainty wavering visibly for the first time. "But they were disturbing my peace," she insisted, though with less conviction. "I measured the sound levels both at your property line and inside the restaurant," Officer Wilson continued. "Would you like to see the readings?" Without waiting for her response, he showed her the log decibel measurements on his device, then played a brief clip from his body camera showing the quiet atmosphere of a property line. "This doesn't just inconvenience the department, Ms. Matthews. It diverts resources from actual life-threatening situations." His voice took on a gravity that made Karen shift uncomfortably. "While dispatch was handling your call, there were 3 genuine emergencies waiting in the queue." Karen started to respond, but her words died in her throat as a paramedic in uniform approached the restaurant, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. She waved when she spotted Officer Wilson. "Hey, James," the woman called, "grabbing a quick dinner before my next shift." She approached them, her expression brightening with recognition. "You were at that accident on Highway 5 earlier, right?" "Yeah," Officer Wilson nodded. "How's the little girl, Maddie?" The paramedic's expression grew somber. "Touch and go. We were stretched thin today. Had to call in off-duty personnel for backup because 3 of our units were already responding to other calls." She glanced at Karen, noting her civilian clothes. "You family of someone inside?" Officer Wilson maintained his professional composure. "Ms. Matthews here had a concern about noise levels at the restaurant." "Noise?" The paramedic's eyebrows rose slightly, her gaze lingering on Karen. "Huh. Well, I've got 15 minutes to grab something before potentially another 12-hour shift. Nice seeing you, James." As the paramedic walked away, Karen stood motionless, her earlier indignation deflating under the weight of this new context. The reality of what emergency services actually meant was suddenly, uncomfortably tangible. "Ms. Matthews," Officer Wilson said, his voice quieter now, "I understand that problems can feel overwhelming sometimes, but I need you to understand the ripple effects of calling 911 for situations like this." He gestured toward his cruiser. "Every unit diverted to a non-emergency means someone else might wait longer for help when seconds count." The walk back to her house felt interminable. Karen's heels clicked against the pavement with each step, the sound uncomfortably loud in the quiet neighborhood. Officer Wilson had left after explaining that while he wouldn't cite her this time, he was required to file a report. His parting words hung in the air. Repeated misuse of emergency services could result in fines up to $1,000 or even criminal charges. Karen's phone buzzed in her hand. A text from her sister. "How's your evening going? Better?" She couldn't bring herself to respond. As she approached her driveway, she noticed movement behind curtains in neighboring houses. The Johnsons across the way stood on their porch, talking in low voices while glancing in her direction. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly widow who had lived on the street for 40 years, was walking her small dog and deliberately crossed to the other side when she saw Karen. The subtle censure in these actions pierced Karen more deeply than any direct confrontation could have. Inside her immaculate home, Karen locked the door and leaned against it, finally alone with her thoughts. The house felt emptier than usual, a silence more pronounced without Derek's presence. She hadn't realized how much she filled that silence with complaints since he left 3 months ago. She poured another glass of wine with trembling hands, but instead of drinking it, she found herself staring at her reflection in the dark window. A woman she barely recognized looked back at her, face flushed, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes bright with unshed tears. Karen opened her laptop and, before she could stop herself, typed Highway 5 accident into the search bar. Local news results appeared immediately, including a headline from just hours earlier. 7-year-old Maddie Reynolds in critical condition following Highway 5 collision. The article included a school photo of a smiling girl with missing front teeth and bright butterfly clips in her hair. The screen blurred as Karen's eyes filled with tears. She thought of her own niece about the same age as Maddie and imagined her scared and injured, waiting for help to arrive. Help that might have been delayed because someone somewhere had called 911 to complain about music they could barely hear. Her gaze drifted to the framed photos on her bookshelf. Happier times with Derek, vacations with friends, or college graduation. When had she become this person? When had her reflex shifted from tolerance to complaint, from patience to entitlement? Karen closed the laptop and moved to the kitchen, where the bottle of wine still stood half empty on the counter. She poured it down the sink and filled a glass with water instead. Through her kitchen window, she could see Familia Kitchen across the street. The restaurant's lights would stay on for another hour or so. From this distance, she couldn't hear any music at all. What she could see were families and couples enjoying their meals, staff moving efficiently between tables, Alina Morales speaking animatedly with an elderly couple near the window. On her refrigerator, partially hidden beneath a grocery list and a dentist appointment reminder, was a faded photo of Karen with her parents at her first job's holiday party. She'd been a server at a family restaurant not unlike Familia Kitchen. She remembered the pride she felt earning her own money, and how difficult customers had sometimes left her in tears in the break room. Karen removed the magnets and held the old photo, studying her younger, more hopeful face. The woman staring back from 15 years ago would be horrified by tonight's behavior. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Karen felt the protective shell of indignation crack open, exposing the raw truth beneath. This wasn't about noise or neighborhood standards or city ordinances. This was about her, about the lonely, bitter person she was becoming, one complaint at a time.